The city does not need the sun or moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives it light, and the Lamb is its lamp. The nations will walk by its light, and the kings of earth will bring their splendor into it. Its gates will never be shut, for there will be no night there. The glory and honor of nations will be brought into it, and nothing impure will ever enter it, nor will anyone who does what is shameful or deceitful, but only those whose names are written in the book of life. Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, as clear as crystal, flowing from the throne of God. This scene from Revelation reads like a description of the ideal version of Jerusalem. But what if this concept was older than the Bible? Older even than the city of Jerusalem itself? I'm your host, Jason, and you're listening to Dragons in Genesis. In the last episode, David ran off to join the Philistines while Saul ruled over Judah. Despite his service to the Philistine king, David's loyalty was called into question by some of the other leaders, and he was asked to not participate in the upcoming war against Israel. Despite the rejection, he continued to serve the Philistines by hunting down Amalek, who had been raiding Philistine cities and whom Saul had failed to exterminate in the past. Here David succeeded and gave us our last excuse for why he should be chosen king over Saul. Meanwhile, Saul and his sons were battling the Philistines and losing. The Israelites were overrun, and Saul was grievously injured. In order to avoid death at the hands of the uncircumcised Philistines, the king asked his armor-bearer to kill him. But the man refused, so Saul fell upon his own sword. The Philistines then stripped Saul of his belongings and brought them away to their own lands. This brings us to the end of the first book of Samuel, and right into a staggering contradiction. In the opening scene of 2 Samuel, we find David returning from his battle with the Amalekites, which went down at the same time as Saul's loss to the Philistines. A man approaches David and declares he just came from Saul's camp. He identifies himself as an Amalekite, which is not a good move on his part. And he then reports to David that Saul and Jonathan are both dead. When David asks how it happened, we are told that Saul spoke with the Amalekite during the battle and asked the man to kill him because he had been filled with a great darkness. There's no mention here of any injury. So the Amalekite slew Saul and then took his crown and bracelets away with him, and here he brings them to David, thus passing the mantle of kingship from Saul to David. If 1 Samuel 31 was the true story, then none of this could have happened. But if none of what this Amalekite said is true, then how does he happen to stroll up with Saul's gear? What we have here are 2 different versions of the death of Saul. In one version, he falls on his own sword, and in another, a traveler kills him, but brings his crown and bracelets to David. The Deuteronomic editors preserved both versions, and rabbis have argued for centuries how Saul actually died. The most common apologetic is that the events of 1 Samuel 31 reflect Saul's actual death, and the tale told by the Amalekite in 2 Samuel 1 are just a story the man is telling and not what actually happened. He's essentially lying. How he came by the crown and bracelets if Saul was stripped by the Philistines, I suppose that was just magic. At this point, David and all his men lamented the death of Saul, which doesn't make much sense as David is still fighting on behalf of the Philistines. So he's leading a Philistine army, which just avenged the sacking of a town in Philistine control by hunting down Amalek, while another band of Philistines killed Saul and an Israelite army. And these Philistines, with David, are weeping over the victory? That doesn't quite add up. This is what happens when you don't outline your story before writing it. The compilers stitched together different stories in different orders. David's army here is obviously an Israelite army, even though he is returning from a battle in which he fought on the side of the Philistines. After mourning Saul's death for a few hours, David asks the Amalekite why he struck down an anointed man. Of course, he did it because he was asked by Saul to do so. But this doesn't appease David, who has his soldiers instantly kill the messenger on the spot. Later, David will declare that this man was innocent. In honor of Saul and Jonathan, David orders the people to teach their good deeds to their children, and states that their deeds are mentioned in the book of the just. How could their deeds be written in this book if they only just died, and David is only just now deciding to preserve their memories? This statement from David is an ideological statement, giving a fictive origin to a current situation. There was once a collection of writings called Book of the Just, or Book of the Right, or Book of the Upright Man, which would later be known as the Book of Jasher. This likely appeared as a sort of fictive history for the Israelites. It appears 2 additional times in the Old Testament, much the same way it appears here. Some great deed is done by a character, and then someone states that it's mentioned in the Book of Jasher. One earlier reference was in the book of Joshua, when the hero commanded the sun to stand still in the sky during a battle. Obviously, this book was an old version of their history, and the new version put forth by the Deuteronomist author draws upon the older tales. The rewriting of national history was nothing new and wouldn't end there, as the Book of Chronicles rewrites the account of the Kings, and Jubilees rewrites the account of Genesis. Sadly, the Book of Jasher is lost to history. But if you follow me on Facebook, you might recall that I recently acquired a copy of the Book of Jasher. So what's going on? There are 3 books of Jasher. The first is the one referenced in the Old Testament. It's lost. The third is an 18th century forgery. The second, the one that I have, is a Jewish midrash. It's purported to be a recreation of the original Book of Jasher. It preserves many Jewish tales like the struggle between Esau and Nimrod, but this version can't be traced back more than about 500 years. Prior to that, its history grows murky. It's obviously a collection of Jewish writings that Jews believe in. But we can't honestly say that this is the lost book of Jasher. Anyway, back to the story. David has a pillar erected to the fallen army and tells the people not to inform the Philistines because they would rejoice. Does he not realize that the Philistines were there when it happened? Like, they were the dudes who did the killing. They celebrated by crucifying Saul's body on their wall and running off with all of his gear. This would be like the losing coach telling the press not to inform the winners of the Super Bowl of their victory, while across the field, the other coach is getting drenched in Gatorade. I'm pretty sure they already know. The first chapter ends with a hymn to fallen soldiers that has a few direct mentions of Saul and Jonathan worked into the song. This is likely an older song that has been repurposed for this narrative. One sentence of note comes in verse 26, when we read that the love between David and Jonathan was closer than between men and women. While this doesn't definitively reveal a homosexual relationship between the two, this description of love between 2 males is typically reserved for that type of relationship. Homosexuality wasn't always profane or illegal in the ancient world. It was openly accepted in many ancient cultures, and many classic heroes were gay or bi. David and Jonathan's behavior throughout the book of 1 Samuel would certainly point in this direction. If these were old bits of folklore that predated the reforms, we would expect to see references that the compilers forgot to trim when they repurposed the stories, such as David having a male lover, or the keeping of house gods that we saw in the last book. Other pairs of men whose love is beyond the love of women would be Achilles and Patroclus, and Gilgamesh and Enkidu. So while this statement isn't conclusive, it is suggestive that there's more to the story of David than the Bible preserves. In chapter 2, David is anointed by the men of Judah. He's now their chosen king, so he must be anointed. I guess they forgot that Samuel anointed him king before Saul even met the boy, back when Goliath was still alive. But David's new kingship is off to a rocky start. Abner, Saul's general, chooses Saul's son Ishbaal to be the new king. So the southern kingdom of Judah follows David, but the northern kingdom of Israel follows Ishbaal. Now you might be a bit confused, as the end of 1 Samuel saw the line of Saul extinguished, his 3 sons all dead. So what's the deal? Again, we have an example of 2 different versions of one story. In one version, Saul's line ended and then David took over. In another version, the descendants of Saul were David's enemies. How do you preserve both versions? Saul's line ended, except for that one last son that no one knew about. Ishbaal comes out of nowhere in chapter 2, leading the northern tribes. Now Ishbaal, his name meaning man of Baal, would later be changed in some manuscripts to Ishbosheth, meaning man of shame. This is an obvious fabrication, as no one would name their son man of shame. Originally he was seen as a servant of Baal, and at that time there wasn't a firm line between the original god, Baal, and his updated version, Yahweh. And so it wasn't uncommon for Yahweh worshippers to be named for the older god. And Ishbaal wasn't even an uncommon name. This exact name was found on the side of a ceramic jar from the 10th century BCE, in this case belonging to someone named Ishbaal ben Bada, meaning man of Baal, son of Bada. So Ishbosheth, or Ishbaal, controls Israel while David controls Judah. David and Ishbaal meet at a spring, each bringing 12 young soldiers and having them fight each other for sport. Perhaps this contest was meant to decide which of the 2 kings was superior, but the text doesn't say. During the contest, a fierce battle broke out between the other soldiers of each side, and the Israelites were quickly routed. Abner, the general serving under Ishbaal, was pursued by one of David's men, a man named Asahel. During the pursuit, Abner turned and stabbed the man in the groin with a spear. More of David's men joined in the pursuit, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of Benjaminites who had sided with Abner. So essentially what we have is some contest between the 2 kings that erupts in an all-out war, with David hunting down the descendants of Saul in an attempt to kill them, which is in opposition to his oath to Saul in the last book to never wipe out his lineage. Now the plot thickens in chapter 3 when we learn that Abner is feuding with Ishbaal, reminding the king that Yahweh had chosen David as successor to the throne and not Ishbaal. Now this makes no sense at all, as it was Abner who convinced Ishbaal to take the throne instead of following David. Again, we have 2 conflicting versions. Did Ishbaal seize the throne for himself, or was he serving at the behest of his general? Both versions are preserved. This version of Abner is loyal to David instead of his enemy, and so he sneaks off to make a deal with the king of Judah. He will bring all of the lands of Israel to David in exchange for delivering David's wife Milcah to him. Milcah, if you remember, was one of David's earlier wives, the daughter of Saul, whom David paid 200 foreskins for. Wait, How is this a deal? Abner will give Israel over to David. In exchange, Abner will also bring Milcol to David. Man, Abner sucks at making deals. Abner and David reach an agreement, and so Abner leaves to return to Ishbaal and convince him to quit his throne and serve David. But there's a problem. Remember how just now Abner stabbed a guy in the junk with a spear? Well, that guy's brother Joab was alive and in town and looking for vengeance. He ambushes Abner and stabs him in the groin with a spear. With Abner dead, there's no way to make a deal with Ishbaal, who is currently mourning the death of his general. So 2 of Ishbaal's other captains betray their king and kill him in his sleep and chop off his head. They take the severed head to David as a peace offering. With the rival king now deceased, David can rule over both nations. For this, David has mixed feelings. On the one hand, he's now king over all 12 tribes. On the other hand, his rival was killed without his permission. So he has the 2 captains dismembered and their mutilated bodies strung up. He is then anointed king by the northern tribes, and the 2 nations are united under the king of Judah. Of course, this never happened. At the ostensible time of the story, Israel was a thriving nation, and Judah was a handful of villages and a couple of small cities. And the 2 nations were completely independent of one another. What's more is the picture here is painted as though Judah was the superior nation, but history reveals quite the opposite. Jerusalem, the major city of the southern kingdom, meant nothing to the kingdom of Israel until the Assyrian conquest of 740 BCE, when many Israelites fled south into Judah. During the 10th century, the smallest tribes of Israel would have been more than a match for the entire nation of Judah, which was technologically stunted, economically impoverished, and socially fragmented. The days of Judean superiority wouldn't begin until the rebuilding period under Cyrus the Great at the end of the 6th century BCE, and the 2 nations wouldn't be united under one ruler until the 2nd century BCE. After being anointed king for something like the 5th time, David takes his army to Jerusalem, but the Jebusites who lived there denied him entry. So he besieged the city, took it from the Jebusites, and declared it his own. He also puts to death all the blind and lame because their presence offends Yahweh, and the impure cannot enter the house of God. And of course, this contradicts previous accounts in Joshua and Judges, where earlier groups captured Jerusalem from the Jebusites or bargained with them for possession of the city. This is an old problem the narrators deal with, and each author finds a different solution. Jerusalem was once the city of Jebus, a city ruled by the Jebusites, a small tribe that was eventually absorbed by the other Israelites, though some of them retained their Jebusite identity for centuries. How do you claim that the ethnically pure Israelites wiped out all the natives when it's obvious that many are still around? Well, you claim that there were exceptions. In this case, they only wiped out the blind and the lame. In the book of Joshua, they allowed the Jebusites to continue living in Jerusalem. So at this point, David builds a giant house of cedar and a fortress on Mount Zion, and around it he builds the city of Jerusalem, giving us yet another origin of the holy city. Was it an ancient city captured and renamed, or did David build it from the ground up? We now see a shift in importance from places like Shiloh, where Yahweh had been worshipped, to Zion, a holy mountain where he would soon live. Worship of their patron deity is being centralized, and this story is giving us justification for this new location of worship. The outlying shrines and their temples and the old ways of worship are no longer allowed. it must all be done under the supervision of a select group of priests in a single building. This likely didn't occur until the new temple was built by Cyrus after the Babylonian exile. But something else is going on here as well. Near Jerusalem is the mountain of the Lord, Mount Zion, where the living waters flow from the throne of God and bring nourishment to all the land. This isn't a new myth in the land of Israel. This is a relocation of an older sacred site that fell into disuse centuries earlier. In 1190 BCE, the city of Ugarit was abandoned. The city's patron deity was Baal, meaning the Lord, who was eventually granted the title Yah by his father El, thus becoming Yahweh. He lived on the peak of Mount Zephon outside the city, from which the living waters flowed to nourish the land. Not only the similarities between Baal and Yahweh so numerous, they're often accepted as old and new versions of the same God, but scholars have also pointed out the linguistic similarities between Mount Zephon and Mount Zion, as well as their near identical roles within the ancient cults. The religion that grew up around Zion wasn't new, but it returned to the truly ancient, with a few new details added in. And we'll see an example of the interchangeability of Baal and Yahweh at the end of this same chapter. As soon as David takes his place as ruler of the United Kingdom of Jews, he is attacked by the Philistines. He asks Yahweh how to proceed and is given instructions from his God on how to fight back. He engages them in battle at a place called the Upper Breaches, near the Valley of Giants, and the Israelites break through the Philistine lines and scatter the enemy. The retreating army leaves behind their gods, which David carries off. The place is then named Yahweh Has Broken Through, which is just a retooling of the name the Upper Breaches, so we have another etiological tale that gives the origin of a place name. It's already referred to as the Breaches, but then it earns its name as the Breaches. What's interesting here is the exact name that is used. The text states that it means Yahweh has broken through. The name given for the new Upper Breaches is called Baal Perazim, meaning Baal has broken through, or the breaches of Baal. And so here in 2 Samuel, the names of Yahweh and Baal are interchangeable. Later, the Israelites attack the Philistines again at a sacred grove for ritual mourning, and Yahweh physically attacks them first to send the Philistine army into disarray before the Israelites charge in for the slaughter. Now that David has conquered Jerusalem and built himself a house, it's time to begin centralizing not only the government, but worship. This is, after all, a story to lend legitimacy to the current state of affairs in which Jerusalem is the central city. So he sends 70,000 soldiers to the house of Abinadab to fetch the ark and bring it to Jerusalem. Now you'd think that if this was Yahweh's plan all along, to have the one true house of God established in the city that he names the center of the world, he might have done so as soon as the Israelites reached the Promised Land. After all, they conquered Jerusalem back in the book of Joshua. Oh well, better late than never, I guess. So Jerusalem has now been conquered 3 times, so it must be safe for Yahweh to enter, and it's unlikely that the city will ever fall again. Spoiler alert, during its long history, Jerusalem will be captured a total of 44 different times. The box containing Yahweh is placed on a wagon and led by Abinadab's sons and accompanied by David and a group of minstrels who play music on their harps, lutes, drums, and other assorted instruments. Music associated with Yahweh's presence will be removed from the temple practices at a later date. But here, in this story, The presence of Yahweh is still connected with music. Another detail concerning proper temple practices is that only certain priests are allowed contact with the ark. To deter others from climbing above their station, a host of cautionary tales were invented, which outline the severity of punishments against those who worship on their own or approach the ark, such as the entire book of Numbers, or this particular tale contained in chapter 6. Along their journey from Aminadab's house to Jerusalem, the wagon rocked and the ark tilted and threatened to topple to the ground. One of Aminadab's sons reached out to steady God's sacred crate and was instantly killed for his efforts. Yahweh struck him dead on the spot for the heinous crime of preventing the helpless God contained inside a box from falling to the ground. This scene would, many generations later, inspire a 35-year-old film director to smite the unworthy Nazis with face-melting special effects in Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. Because of this smiting, David feared the ark, so he sent it to the home of a Gethite, one of the Philistines from the neighborhood where Goliath grew up. There sure are a lot of David-Philistine connections, aren't there? It makes me wonder if he was originally a Philistine folk hero who was adopted by the Israelites. Anyway, Yahweh blesses the house of the Gethite, who apparently lives near Jerusalem, indicating that the land wasn't as homogeneous as the authors would have us believe. So then David decides to finally bring Yahweh into Jerusalem. There's more music, and David is seen by his first wife, Milcah, dancing with the minstrels and servants during the celebration. Once Yahweh is in his place, Milcah asks David if he plans to continue to embarrass himself by dancing with the peasants. He replies that he was chosen king over her father, and will not only dance with the servants, but he'll get naked with them as well just to spite her. Not a very pleasant husband. It might be prudent to point out here that David had 0 children with his first wife. So now, Yahweh is established in Jerusalem, which is being set up as a new Ugarit, with Mount Zion standing in for Mount Zephon. But there's a small problem. The figure of David, who comes from a folk hero or a god, wasn't a wise prophet. He was a conqueror. And by the time these writings were compiled into a single narrative, the Israelites already had folk tales surrounding the founder of their great temple, a man named Jedediah. What's worse is they technically had 2 legendary founders of their temple, the second being a man named Solomon. So the 2 founders, Jedediah and Solomon, were merged into one, and Solomon just became another name for Jedediah. With one legendary founder of the temple and another legendary founder of a city, those 2 were then merged to be part of the same family, and so Solomon/Jedediah becomes David's son and heir to his throne. One king establishes the city and unifies the land, while the other establishes the temple. What's even more confusing is that both David and Solomon will receive help from the king of Tyre, along with a great quantity of cedar, to build their respective palaces. So the story of how David built his house and how Solomon built his temple are in essence the same story, recycled for 2 different rulers. And so now we have another problem. The king lives in a great cedar house, while Yahweh still lives in a box inside of a tent. And if there's confusion as to who, David or Solomon, constructed this great cedar temple, then something must be done to clear up the confusion. So how do the authors address this issue? By claiming in chapter 7 that Yahweh does indeed want a great house. But not just yet. Even though David has offered, Yahweh says that right now he prefers to live in his tent. He's willing to wait one more generation before his palatial temple is erected. It's kind of like when my dog needs to go outside, but when I offer to put him out, he pretends he's watching TV, and then as soon as I give up and sit down, suddenly he has to go outside right that instant. Yeah, Yahweh is acting sort of like that. He can spend centuries living in a tent. And despite the fact that he's offered a temple, he doesn't want it. He likes his cozy tent. Oh, but wait, your son is born? I need a temple. So we get a new covenant between David and Yahweh, promising a lasting dynasty for the king in exchange for Yahweh receiving a home in Jerusalem and his own throne. Yahweh will be the father, and David's descendants will be Yahweh's sons, a direct reference to the concept of divine royalty, which will later be rejected in Jerusalem. We also see something else of importance in chapter 7. Near the end, Yahweh tells David that there is no God but himself. This is our first glimpse of monotheism in the Old Testament. This tale so far is multi-layered. It's first used as a folk tale of a divine conqueror, alongside those mentioned in the book of Judges. Then as a dynastic ruler whose descendant named Zerubbabel will later reclaim the city of Jerusalem after the Babylonian exile. And finally, as a unifying force to merge Israel and Judah in order to justify the annexation of the northern kingdom under John Hyrcanus. And that is where we'll leave David for now. But we'll dig into his rule in the next episode. Now, I have a quick question from Megan who says, I'm newish to atheism and I can't read fast enough about it. I've read Christopher Hitchens, R.N. Ross, Seth Andrews, and Richard Dawkins. I'm very interested in any book recommendations you might have. I love the historical context you give in your podcast, if that helps. If you've read those 4, I think you're already off to a strong start. But if you're looking to get some history thrown in, I would suggest the books Nailed and Jesus Mything in Action by David Fitzgerald, The Incredible Shrinking Son of Man by Robert Elm Price, and On the Historicity of Jesus by Richard Carrier. Now that last one might make your brain melt, so I would suggest taking a break between each chapter. And if you want to get a taste for those 3 authors, all have appeared at least once on the Thinking Atheist podcast and the Mythicist Milwaukee podcast. I'd suggest finding those episodes and giving them a listen. You can also browse the list that I have on my website, dragonsandgenesis.com. There's a page entitled Resources that's filled with books, along with a few lecture series that are available from Audible. I would also suggest the book Did Moses Exist by D.L. Murdoch, which is on that list. Try that one. I also have a comment from Kelly who says, thanks for all the research and work you do for this podcast. It's so interesting and horrific. I get excited every time I see a new episode pop up. Thanks again. The encouragement and appreciation I get for this show go a long way toward keeping this show running. It's truly a pleasure having the listeners that I have. So thank you. For the rest of you, if you have a question or a comment, please send a message through the contacts page on dragonsandgenesis.com or through Facebook at facebook.com/dragonsandgenesis. If you want to support the show, head over to iTunes or wherever you get your podcast and give us a good review. Also, share the episodes on Facebook or any other social media platforms. There's also an Amazon wish list in a pinned post on Facebook. That contains a boatload of books. These books help me to bring all of you better content. So, as always, thank you for listening.